Director of the gallery. And tonight's program is being presented in conjunction with the exhibition Visualizing 19th Century New York in our Focus Gallery and curated by David Jaffe. I just wanted to remind everyone to turn off your devices or put them on vibrate so that we can all enjoy our speaker tonight. And also just to call to your attention a few more programs in the public program schedule, which you can get outside, that are still upcoming in conjunction with this exhibition. On November 7th, we have a special print study day at the New York Historical Society to give our audience members a chance to really go up close and personal with 19th century materials. And that is being hosted by Marilyn Kushner, the curator there. And in addition, on December 11th, the curator David Jaffe will give a guided tour of the exhibition, and then our program will conclude on Sunday, December 14th, with a special concert that will focus on music of the period of the mid to late 19th century. So I hope you will join us, and also invite you all, of course, to visit the exhibitions that are on view, including Barbara Nessum and Art for Life, and there are many more programs also upcoming for that exhibition. So welcome, everyone, and David Jaffe will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Marianne. So Josh Brown is known to us quite well here at the BGC. He's been generous in offering his expertise to our symposia on new media and as well as 19th century New York. And he's really has an enormous range of accomplishments in many, many fields that makes most of us sort of regular historians quite envious. He's a graphic artist, an illustrator, and the recent author of Ithaca, a graphic novel that was serialized in the online journal Commonplace, where you can find it. He's also been an important figure in creating and thinking about new media for a long time, whether that be, and maybe I'm revealing my own age, Who Built America when it was an interactive CD-ROM, which is a wonderful textbook about the American history and working people. History Matters, the U.S. History Survey on the web, the 9/11 Digital Archive, one of my favorites, The Lost Museum, which is a virtual as well as visualization of Barnum's American Museum. He's also an important educator who's helped to run a series of NEH summer institutes for college teachers on the Civil War, American Civil War, the visual culture of the American Civil War. He's a graduate of the City College of New York History Department as well as Columbia University. Also in his role as an educator, he's executive director for the Center for Media and Learning, the American Social History Project at the CUNY Graduate Center, as well as a professor of history in the History Department at CUNY Graduate Center and the Interactive Technology and Pedagogy Program. And finally, Josh is the author of many publications, including his prize-winning book, Beyond the Lines, Pictorial Reporting, Everyday Life in the Crisis of Gilded Age America, which really demonstrates the power of the pictorial press of the 19th century in forging a new visual culture. And I have a feeling you might be learning even more about the pictorial press, as Josh is also now working on a new project on the visual culture of the American Civil War. So it's my pleasure to introduce Josh Brown.
Well, thank you, David. And I also want to thank Melissa Gerstein and Marianne LaMonica for making all the arrangements for tonight. And I appreciate, at least it's not raining like last night, but appreciate your being here. I have to just say that it's always also a pleasure to be at the Bard Graduate Center. The activities here are always quite wonderful. I urge you, if you haven't yet, to see the exhibit just up the street, if I remember correctly. Or down the street, one way or the other. And I must admit, I grew up a block away from here, so it's always great to come back to the old neighborhood, which looked quite different back in the mid-20th century. So, to begin, from the mid-1850s into the 1890s, there were two pictorial weeklies. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, obviously on the left, and Harper's Weekly. Leslie's first appeared in 1855, and Harper's 2 years later. Other publications rose and fell, but these two endured, and for those years, before photographs could be reproduced with type, their wood engravings of events provided Americans with the latest pictorial news. Weekly access to pictorial news was, in itself, a new phenomenon for Americans, and Harper's and Frank Leslie's only really gained readership and legitimacy with the Civil War. Now, to our hyper-sophisticated, or at least seemingly hyper-sophisticated, early 21st century eyes, in an environment saturated with pictures on, iPhones and other cell phones, Instagrams and YouTube, GoPros now, and many other devices, these pictures, I'm sure, seem very quaint, unconvincing, a bit difficult to decipher, let alone care about. Lots of crinoline, as we can see in both the pictures, overdressed children, wasp-waisted women, and for that matter, often wasp-waisted men, relatively interchangeable in appearance and all frozen in cluttered scenes. This evening, I'd like us to put on 19th century glasses and examine the pictures that were published in these two news periodicals and consider how they recorded, reported, and delivered visual news and how they were read, or to put it another way, what 19th century readers got from them. And in the process, we'll look at some of the ways that these apparently picturesque and opaque publications actually regularly brought a world of turmoil into the readers' homes, or as the sensationalistic title I gave it suggests, into the parlor. Now, this is not to say that these publications' images were always accurate or reliable. In his 1853 novel, Bleak House, Charles Dickens cast an eye on the accuracy and skill of the new profession of the artist reporter that was almost as jaundiced as the one he aimed at the British legal profession. Dickens described the pictorial coverage of the singular demise via spontaneous combustion, for those of you who have read the novel, of the loathsome venal villain, Mr. Crook. And he described it this way. This is Dickens writing. Then there comes the artist of a picture newspaper, with a foreground and figures ready drawn from anything, from a wreck on the Cornish coast to a review in Hyde Park, or a meeting in Manchester. And in Mrs. Perkins' own room, memorable evermore because of the spontaneous combustion, he then and there throws in upon the block Mr. Crook's house as large as life. In fact, considerably larger, making it a very temple of it. Similarly, being permitted to look in at the door of the fatal chamber, he depicts that apartment as 3/4 of a mile long by 50 yards high. So Dickens' derision of the skill and accuracy of the British pictorial press, from the artist reporters on the scene to the engravers who carved the images on wood for reproduction on the printed page, and we'll go into that in a few moments, it was shared by many contemporaries across the Atlantic. The criticism was most explicit relatively early in the history of U.S. news engravings in commentary about the authenticity of the reporting of the Civil War in the American pictorial press, particularly Frank Leslie's and Harper's Weekly. This is a cartoon from Vanity Fair, a short-lived humor publication, War Democrat for what it's worth, during the Civil War, that obviously is making fun at the supposedly on-the-spot artist, who's of course using toy soldiers to make his on-the-spot battle drawing. Such contemporary critical attitudes were fueled by the belief in the seeming veracity and authenticity of the equally new technology of the photograph, one that we still haven't shaken off today. For example, with the unprecedented photographic record of the war, historians have tended to rubber stamp that vision of photographic truth. And they often suggest that, due to the inability to directly reproduce photographs in print, which was not to be perfected until the 1890s with the invention of the halftone, the public was frustrated by unreliable news illustrations. But this notion of the reign of the photograph ignores what photos did not provide contemporary viewers. That is, their static nature and incapacity to record action, not to mention sometimes offering their own fictions, such as, of course, now the well-known moving of bodies in some of the aftermath of battle photographs. What photographs were especially limited in conveying to viewers were the sort of pictorial narratives that, in contrast, drew readers in the hundreds of thousands to the illustrated press, which kept wood engraving the premier medium for visual reporting until the 1890s. And so, it also was a medium that offered those readers its own peculiar modes of authenticity. Now, what do I mean by authenticity? I think we should begin with the new type of journalist, the artist reporter, or as they were often called, special artists. The intrepid special artist covering the battlefront was one of the new figures of journalism that emerged during the Civil War. While Vanity Fair and yet another cartoon lampooned the pictorial press's claim of their artist reporters' on-the-spot eyewitness veracity, here noting the incredible clairvoyance of a special artist who managed to witness the sudden explosion of a warship. The wartime artists, in fact, did undertake the hazardous task of recording battles, and after the war, artists were regularly dispatched to cover predictable, for want of a better phrase, events, whether receptions, rallies, and other public and private ceremonials, or local incidents such as fires, floods, and other disasters that usually were of a long enough duration for an artist to get there. But a good part of the artist reporter's work occurred after the event. Their sketches were reconstructions involving the visual transcribing of the details of location and circumstance, supplemented, much like traditional print journalists, by testimonials from participants and witnesses. Leslie's commented regarding its coverage of an 1873 Atlantic shipwreck in this way. This is Leslie's writing. Most of these scenes so pictured are real. Others are pictorial reprints of authentic statements and descriptions whereby our artists have caught and transfixed the reports of the telegraph. The Civil War special artists' work process consisted of hasty shorthand sketches, and this is a sketch by Alfred Woad during the Civil War. This is right after the Battle of Antietam. Especially in the chaos, these shorthand sketches were especially done in the chaos of battle, riot, or other catastrophes. And they were supplemented with written annotations. I don't think this one has particularly detailed annotations, but they could often include, this soldier looks like 50 more of these soldiers, put soldiers here, a cloudy sky, indications like that. And if time permitted, those artists also later worked up the drawings into a more elaborate drawing, as actually in this case where there's been whites and highlights have been added by Woad and additional detail. But this was just the first step of a process that often delivered pictorial news of the day to the public within a week of events. A process that involved the division of labor and speed that made the pictorial press economically viable and useful to its readers. Once the sketch like this, arrived in Harper's or Frank Leslie's New York offices, the art superintendent made his selections, and a rough outline version of the sketch that fit the proportions of the printed page was made and then rubbed in reverse upon a plank of Turkish boxwood. Now, a word about this essential piece of wood. Wood for engraving had to be cut across the grain so that the resulting plank could provide the proper surface for flexible incisions, a method perfected in the late 18th century by the copperplate engraver Thomas Bewick. Now, just to emphasize this point, wood cuts, the traditional wood cut that had existed for centuries, involves cutting along the grain of the wood. You do not have a flexible, an ability to have a flexible line because you have to cut across the grain. It'll split up the wood if you don't follow the grain. Whereas a wood engraving is across the grain, which means it's a harder surface, but it allows a greater capacity to put a line anywhere if you have the elbow power to do it. The best wood for this, for this across the grain method, was the durable Turkish boxwood tree. But the diameter of the boxwood tree was rarely reached beyond 6 inches. That size was fine if you had a small engraving. But what about the impressive full page and double page cuts? Not to mention that occasionally these 4-page illustrations often appearing in special supplements that both publications often had, particularly if there was a disaster or a presidential assassination or any sort of late-breaking news as we would call it today. Frank Leslie, who had been an engraver for the Illustrated London News, which was the first, really the first successful weekly illustrated newspaper beginning in 1841. It was the model for all other illustrated newspapers, whether it was in France, Germany, or the United States. Frank Leslie was credited with this innovation, which you're seeing right now, a large block composed of smaller sections secured together by a system of sunken nuts and bolts. This was key to the rapid mass production of engraved images. Now, I just should say, as a parenthesis here, I only discovered very, very recently that the National Museum of American History, Smithsonian Institution, didn't know this, but they had a large number of original woodcuts, wood engravings that had been given to the museum probably in the mid-1960s. I don't even know exactly. It turns out they were from a third publication that disappeared after 1864 called the New York Illustrated News. But it was pretty exciting I was allowed to have a chance to take a look at them. And whereas previously I've always shown a diagram, a drawn diagram, this is a case is that they have 60 engravings that you can match to engravings. In fact, I'll show you one in a second. But I just want to mention this because this is a debut for what it's worth. So, returning to the sketch, after it was transferred to this composite wood block, and you'll see the other side in a second, the block was unbolted and a team of draftsmen worked on individual pieces. Then the block was rebolted and sent on to the engraving department. There was a composite. There, the composite block was unbolted again and distributed to a team of engravers based on their specific skills. They had corresponding titles, so that engravers who specialized in doing flora were called pruners. Tailors were those who worked on clothes. Mechanics were machinery, and more disconcertingly, butchers drew people. A 4-page engraving could involve the work of as many as 40 engravers. So, as you can see in this cartoon that was in Yankee Notions in 1852, which is a humor publication, obviously, perched beside a window by day and a lamp or gaslight by night, the illumination focused through a glass globe, which you don't see here, filled with water, the engravers bent over their work, peering through watchmakers' lenses, down upon the block propped, as you can see, on a small sandbag or a leather cushion, and equipped with a number of tools, each with a handle that was designed to fit snugly in the palm of your hand, because you basically were pushing these gravers forward. They maneuvered the block to carve out spaces between the drawn lines. It's an incredibly insane process, because in effect, they thought and worked in what we might term the negative, meaning they cut out what would later appear as white in the finished engraving, leaving the lines in relief to print the black. So if you see a thin line, like those thin lines here, those have been cut out in relief to stand out. Now, they did have tools that allowed you to do, parallel lines. So it wasn't like every line had to be done, but nonetheless, it was heavily labor intensive. And this is actually the flip side of the block that I showed you, the composite block that I showed you before. Through the innovation of the divisible composite boxwood block, the time to engrave a full-page illustration was reduced from more than a week to approximately 8 hours. And it's described by Hiram Merrill, who engraved for Harper's Weekly in the 1890s. Even at that late date, stringent deadlines dictated marathon-like bouts of engraving, often performed overnight. And this is Merrill's recollection of his work. As he described it, Mr. Smithwick, who was the director, would come around about 3 o'clock and whisper, "We're going to be busy tonight, Merrill, so you had better go and get the air. Be back by 6 o'clock. I would promptly head for Dietz's Weinstube, which was crowded under the New York end of the Brooklyn Bridge, and soon another engraver would pop in, and then another, until nearly all the 8 engravers who were to work on the page were collected there. So some solid and liquid food was obtained. And then we usually started up Broadway to study art in the saloons along the way. By 6 o'clock, we had returned to the shop, rested and ready for work. It's an interesting definition of rested. I cannot recall that the engraved work suffered noticeably in quality. So, sober or not, after the individual engravers were finished, the constituent blocks were rebolted together, as you can see here, and the supervising engraver applied the finishing touches, which means he ensured that, or tried to ensure that the incised lines met across these different sections. That was his major responsibility. Which didn't often be the case. And in fact, what you could often see in completed engravings was the portrayal of the contours of these individual blocks appearing as ghostly white lines. You'll often see them in engravings, even the best done engravings. And they were called block marks by the engravers because they were quite noticeable. The engraved jointed block, like this, was then sent to the composing room where it was locked into place with handset type to create a page. And this is actually what the engraving you just saw looked like when it was printed. And this was, as I said, the New York Illustrated News. This is actually an image of the draft riots. So this was published in August 1863. There was more still to the process. I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear. I'm not going to go into more of the details, but those things included making copper plates from the wood engravings, which involved electrotyping, methods of using overlays on the printing press cylinders to increase or decrease the blacks in the pictures. So there was not simply one shade of black that was actually printed involved because of the printing process. And of course the printing itself, and then the packing and the mailing and the distribution to newsboys as well as news dealers. So through this breathless, labor-intensive, elaborate process, news illustrations regularly depicted events of the previous week. Now, what did readers see when they opened the pages of Harper's Weekly or Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper? Unlike photographs that, then as now, capture a moment in time, and in the 19th century, a very static moment in time, wood engravings presented readers with pictorial narratives of events. Adopting many of the conventions of history painting, although often applied to everyday life themes more characteristic of genre painting, the images in the illustrated press were dramatic and detailed diagrams that invited examination and perusal. Viewing an engraving, readers registered a sequence constituting an event as well as that event's defining or decisive moment. Framed within one image, time was compressed, and yet cause and effect became apparent. So, for example, in 1871, as you can see here, engraving depicting the cataclysmic collision between a passenger express train and a petroleum car near New Hamburg, New York, showed the instant of the impact. But the chronology of the accident was compressed within this one illustration. The locomotive and the passenger cars, bathed in gasoline, catch on fire. The locomotive careens into Wappinger Creek, and in the foreground, survivors escape from the explosion and flames. Or, a chain of events also is evident in an 1866 illustration of a disaster that occurred during President Andrew Johnson's visit to Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Citizens converge on the scene to greet the president. The bridge is crowded by men, women, and children, and the bridge collapses, sending bodies tumbling down on the railroad tracks below. Double-page engravings often conveyed startlingly complex narratives. This panoramic image in Frank Leslie's, which was later complemented by local residents, showed the most notorious incident during the 2-week nationwide July 1877 railroad strike, when Philadelphia troops fired on strikers and sympathizers in the Pennsylvania Railroad yards. Now, this would be one that would involve those, many engravers working for a very, very long time. But, I mean, this is a case where, you see the troops firing. It's a little hard to see here. You see some of the demonstrators and strikers in the front of the crowd, throwing rocks. And then you're seeing a range of, and some you can even see there, this goes all the way into the distance in terms of seeing the crowd, but both the crowd advancing and the crowd running away, and many different mini narratives, not to mention many different types. And indeed, for what it's worth, this is one where participants in the strike wrote to Frank Leslie's to compliment on how they were portrayed, not in terms of actions, but how they appeared. That the accuracy of the type of dress that people wore, as they said, the appropriate dress for a demonstration. Depictions of accidents exemplified the sequential nature of wood engravings representation, but they could also reveal some of the pitfalls in this narrative approach, such as this avalanche of bodies falling from the windows of a burning Fall River, Massachusetts factory in 1874, or my favorite, which I can never understand until I finally began to think about this, that when an important figure is giving a speech, people are cheering at the same time, obviously trying to capture both sides of an event. In order for his form of pictorial reporting to work, though, the reader's participation was essential. A complete story was not contained in any one image. Its comprehension was dependent upon a broader, for want of a better phrase, meta-narrative that was possessed by the readers, based on print information supplied by the daily press. As the pictorial papers readily acknowledged, they acted as a supplement to the coverage of daily newspapers. In the words of one editorial, they represented, and this is the editorial, pictorially and vividly those things and events which the daily press at best can imperfectly describe. So, in the illustrated press, in the relationship between pictures and text, the pictures' representations predominated. The images often were published with only brief descriptions applicable to the pictures. Public figures assembled in an engraving went unnamed in the accompanying text in the expectation that readers would identify them from earlier appearance in Harper's or Leslie's or from other pictorial sources. And similarly, readers could gain information unremarked upon in the text about aspects of an event as well as a qualitative sense of its context through the painfully detailed rendering of subjects and their dress, the decoration and layout of interiors, and the architecture and terrain of exteriors, this one happening to be the New City Morgue in 1866. At times, though, as in an 1876 engraving showing the aftermath of a fire that devastated the Brooklyn Theater, the picture's story extended far beyond the textual account. While the description listed the personal property collected by authorities in an attempt to identify victims burned beyond recognition, the engraving portrayed an incident that was unreported in the text where, it appears, a woman recognized the belongings of a relative. And as in this gruesome October 1881 picture of the embalming of the body of President James A. Garfield, the illustrations sometimes reveal details hidden from the public eye, unremarked in a text. And remember, this is considered a family newspaper, or certainly one that was in the Parlor. In their structure, conventions, and narrative, these wood engravings of news events were equivalent to performances. Framed in proscenium-like compositions, the poses and gestures in the engravings conveyed emotions that readers readily recognized, having seen them performed on the popular stage. Indeed, the poses struck by figures in engravings could be equated with melodrama's conventions of signaling the resolution of meaning of a scene or an act in a tableau, where the characters' attitudes and arrangements, frozen for a moment, conveyed a visual summary of the emotional situation. So, in short, readers of Frank Leslie's Harper's Weekly and the illustrated press in general viewed weekly visual performances. These topical wood engravings conveyed to readers supplementary, detailed information and a narrative diagram of an event, a combination of education and entertainment that was as likely to be soothing as upsetting. So, what did the pictorial press bring into the parlor? Well, to be sure, a lot of it did not involve panic, nor was it panic-inducing. In fact, in the post-war era of astounding growth and expansion and enterprise, the press breathlessly celebrated industry and innovation, epitomized by the nation's mushrooming railroad network, enthusiastically, for example, charting its exponential growth and triumphs, such as the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Now, having spoken a lot about the Artist Reporter, I have to say, and only thought about this today, that this is a case actually of an image that's based on a photograph. And one of the reasons, aside from the fact that this photograph is pretty famous, is that for the most part, nothing's happening. I mean, the sort of static nature of the narrative is lying there, is indicative, even though it's been changed into a wood engraving. The 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia was perhaps the most public manifestation of this celebration of industry, innovation, and capital. The technological focus of the exhibition was particularly reported in the opening of the Centennial Exposition, and its centerpiece was in Machinery Hall, which was, as you can see here, the coreless engine, a 1,400 horsepower engine that had enough power to run all of the 450 acres of the fair. For 6 months, the pictorial papers regaled readers with pictures of curiosities, of course, and innovation. Visitors got to try out, as the pictorial press showed, the new improved Edison telegraph, which allowed many messages on one wire. For 50 cents, they could write a letter to send home on a new Remington Arms typewriter. And they got to see a demonstration, as you can see here, of Alexander Graham Bell's curious new telephone, which the New York Tribune, among others, asked of what possible use is such an invention. Like coverage of the centennial, the pictorial press energetically reported about the resplendent homes and glamorous pastimes of the increasingly ostentatious wealthy Americans, their mansions, their summer retreats, regattas, races, parties, and glamorous charity balls, such as this one at the Metropolitan Opera in 1884. But amid the pictorial celebration of technology and wealth, the public received regular news and views of disasters. Alternating with glamour and triumphant industry was a persistent vision of the lack of accountability on the part of business. And a part of businesses, especially the railroads. Railroad accidents were a regular feature in the pictorial press. In this case, the December 29, 1876 bridge collapse across the Ohio's Ashtabula River, which led to, for what it's worth, 83 people dying and 60 more being injured. Industrial accidents were a close second in reporting. And particularly coal mine disasters, which were perhaps as frequent as railroad disasters, and often led, interestingly enough, the two things that led often to special supplements of the publication, late-breaking news in the 19th century terms, were coal mine disasters and, of course, urban fires. Chicago Fire being the perfect example, which had more than one supplement to cover all of the news of that particular disaster. And most prominently of all, the disaster of panic and depression, including pictures of rioters in Wall Street wearing, unusually for rioters, top hats and fancy coattails. Now, the pictorial press heralded an era, as I'd said, of astounding growth and expansion and enterprise, but it was also an era of persistent political, social, and economic turmoil. Having survived bloody civil war, the post-war decades would nonetheless reveal one crisis after another, and perhaps the most insistent involved the increasingly violent fluctuations of economic boom and bust. You can really only understand the pictorial press if you remark upon the fact that half of the years between 1865 and 1900 were periods of economic crisis. 1873 to 1877, and some people have argued all the way to 1879, first major industrial depression. 1882 to 1885, another depression. 1893 to 1897. Now, even before the Civil War, the extremes of wealth and poverty were regular features in the pictorial press. This is a cover engraving in Harper's Weekly, and they often were presented with, a sentimental coding. It was always, sort of angelic-looking children, looking over, warming themselves over a manhole cover, and in extremes of wealth and poverty. I think it doesn't take rocket science to see the contrast there. But sentimentality easily slid into portrayals of those extremes in the context of moral and characterological and most often ethnically connected failure. The Irish are the most common figures of poverty, displaying physiognomy, that is, somatic signs on their faces and bodies that signaled their lowly status, and particularly the distinction between so-called deserving and undeserving poor. This is a sort of roadmap of it. This is an engraving in 1867 in Frank Leslie's called "The Mysteries and Miseries of New York City," a very common theme in the publications. The interior of Mrs. McMahon's apartment on number 22 Roosevelt Street. The figures. For the most part, the distinction between the figures that were the undeserving poor, such as the drunken husband in the right-hand corner, the old woman carrying the liquor tankard in the center of the image. I realize I can use the pointer here, and then, quite interestingly, the women who are clearly viewed as blameless. They lack the physiognomy of moral decline, and in this case, the breastfeeding woman, her face modestly turned away from the viewer. And of course, the Irish also were the epitome visually of urban disorder. In this case, in 1867, St. Patrick's Day riot in downtown. But with the unprecedented industrial depression that began in 1873, conditions became so much worse that, at least at first, with some reluctance, the pictorial papers started covering the hardship on a regular basis. But for the first years of the Depression, the causes of the distress were largely viewed as self-induced. This engraving is called "Waiting for the Second Table, Inmates of the Poorhouse on Randall's Island, East River of New York City, forming in line for dinner," and it was published in February 1875. And this is the way Leslie's, in this case, described it. So in this case, they wanted to reinforce what the image is. So to our eyes, this would be a sympathetic image. I think and so for many years when I looked at this, I assumed this was about the hardships, which it indeed is, and the impact of the Depression. The description, and this is only part of the description: "Here are gathered the wrecks of ill-spent lives, the children of misfortune and too often the victim of knavery, men who started life with bright prospects and high resolves, men who struggled valiantly in the battle of existence but met with disaster after disaster until hope and energy were crushed, men lacking the stamina of purpose, who drifted gradually down the stream until they stranded on the shores of Blackwell's Island, men once the center of a rollicking coterie who quaffed their wine and cracked their jokes, heedless of the brink of destruction the bark of pleasure was carrying them, men whose, in case you didn't get the point already, men whose lives were blasted by the luring smiles of faithless women, men whose overconfidence in professed friends wrought their ruin, and men belonging to the ever-filled army of shiftless, purposeless, reckless, and unfortunate human beings, all are to be found there. No exceptions. Now, in keeping with the acclaimed laissez-faire spirit of the age, which it's important to add, did not apply to government railroad subsidies, Frank Leslie's and Harper's heralded voluntary charities, such as the soup kitchen that was run by Delmonico's restaurant during the course of the Depression. And at the same time, they were hostile to demands for work relief, such as this coverage of the Tompkins Square riot in January 1874, which featured, as you can see here, hirsute and ragged foreigners who implicitly and explicitly were viewed as carriers of foreign ideologies such as socialism that were promoting un-American class conflict. The pictorial papers, to a great extent, had no problem in arguing that if you have conflict in class in the United States, it's coming from abroad. It has nothing to do with America. Actually, it sounds like much of the rhetoric we hear today. So there is also a new feature in the coverage during the 1870s Depression, which was the unemployed for the first time traveling around the country thanks to the railroads. Of course, traveling not, in first class, but traveling under boxcars and boxcars on top of boxcars. The press identified them as a new menace, this itinerant poor, better known as the phrase was then not invented but mentioned continuously, the tramp. The tramp is introduced in the 1870s Depression and becomes a common figure in the illustrated press. Yet, as Depression worsened, there's a discernible shift in attitude, which could be seen especially in Frank Leslie's. Leslie's, for example, described this scene in this way. This is an engraving called Early Morning at a Police Station in New York City, Turning Out the Vagrant Night Lodgers, which is also February in 1877. And Frank Leslie's commented, "It has been noticed this winter that among the applicants for lodgings at the stations, an unusually large number represents a class of men and women unaccustomed to such dormitories." Now, Leslie's readership was broader in terms of class and ethnicity than that of Harper's. Harper's viewed it in fact, its subtitle was, the Journal of Civilization, had a much more genteel, very Republican, with a uppercase R, readership. Leslie's had a much broader readership, and as many of those readers slid into misfortune in the pages of Frank Leslie's, they lost the physiognomic signs of immorality. Now, before the Depression, there were other visions of economic turmoil in the pictorial press, in particular, unsympathetic depictions of the burgeoning labor movement and labor activism, such as coverage of the movement for the 8-hour day in the early 1870s, where workers were portrayed as downright ungrateful and very foreign. In this case also, if I remember correctly, a lot of them propping their cigars in their mouths. Leslie's, in this case, described it this way: "It would be difficult to convince ourselves that those who appeared were fair representatives of the working men of the city. They certainly did not exhibit the manly bone and sinew of the land." At the extremity of economic crisis, sometimes created contradictions in coverage. The most startling contrast occurred with the unprecedented 2-week nationwide railroad strike, which I'd mentioned earlier in July and August of 1877. Now, Harper's news and illustrations were characterized by distant panoramic views and murky-faced, ominous crowds. Now, we saw this illustration before. Whereas coverage in Frank Leslie's, such as the double-page engraving that we saw earlier, that showed the Philadelphia militia firing on strikers and sympathizers in Pittsburgh's train yards, offered a much more complicated narrative of social conflict, one that you could argue showed an ambiguity in terms of who's responsible, who's incited the violence, and more importantly, who end up being the victims. And in the case of a lot of coverage, including of riots, once, for example, if rioters are throwing, the formula, of course, is not quite as neat as this, but if you're throwing rocks and the cops are fending them off, for example, in a riot, well, then the physiognomies come out, the ape-like features that were very, very familiar, for example, of poor Irish would be prominent. If the police then, as in the case of the 1871 Orange riot in New York City, then indiscriminately fired into the crowd, killing not only rioters, but lots of bystanders, all of a sudden they lose their physiognomy because they're blameless victims. That was Leslie's strategy. You didn't see that in Harper's Weekly. But for much of the Gilded Age, working people, and particularly trade unionists, were portrayed as trouble. Like this threatening figure on the cover of Harper's Weekly in 1878, proclaiming in brutish dialect, which I'm sure you can't read at the bottom, so I'll read it, but I'm not going to read it with an accent: "Is society to be reorganized? Is the working man to have his rights? That's what I wants to know." Not that there weren't other, if more mundane, I need to add, threats that confronted readers of the pictorial weeklies, especially for the paper's many female readers, such as this scene published in 1874, May 1874, in front of a New York City hotel entitled "Running the Gauntlet." So let me close with one other contrast that suggests that trends in the pictorial press's coverage of the news often had their disruptions that probably surprised and sometimes unsettled the readers. The depiction of African Americans is a case in point. Sympathy and even admiration often characterize the depiction of the efforts of the freed people to achieve equality in the aftermath of the Civil War, as is in this Harper's Weekly cover engraving called The First Vote, where you see actually a very interesting cross-section of different types of African American voters, first-time voters, including obviously the former slave, the an urban, probably artisan figure, of course the black veteran, and so on. But by the mid-1870s, as the federal government abandoned Reconstruction and black rights were viciously abrogated, derogatory images began to predominate, such as this buffoonish illustration in the Republican Harper's Weekly of the, as they were called, small breed family visiting the Centennial Exposition. This was one of a series, so-called Blackville series, that an illustrator named Saul Ettinge did for Harper's Weekly through the course of the 1870s. Now, the Centennial Fair, in fact, exemplified racial exclusion, with no African Americans allowed to work there, except in a Dixie-themed restaurant. And while black women were barred from the women's pavilion, which was basically a pro-suffragist pavilion. Yet, this Frank Leslie's illustration of African Americans admiring the statue of the freed slave in Memorial Hall captured an important contrasting moment in the history of the fair and the experience of black visitors, one that is all the more startling in light of the largely dismissive treatment the statue received by American writers and commentators. One example is William Dean Howells in The Atlantic referred to this as, if I remember correctly, a suspiciously Frenchy figure who you wish to re-chain into bondage. And for what it's worth, this statue was part, and this what also makes it quite interesting, is that this statue was part of the Austrian exhibition and sculpted by an Austro-Italian artist named Francesco Pezzicar. It was the type of statue that you would not see in the United States for another 30, 40 years. Certainly nothing like this in terms of the vision of emancipation. This is also an image that had no textual description, but was presented, in its entirety as an image. So often, inadvertently, we consider people in the past as not as smart as we are today. I think this is certainly I hear students say this all the time. Insensitive, for example, to the insidious racial and ethnic stereotypes we now deride, although we still see today. One of the virtues of closely examining the pictorial press, to paraphrase E.P. Thompson, the great social historian, is that it may help, in fact, rescue the people in the past from the enormous condescension that we have in the present. That's my tale. Thank you. I certainly would be pleased to questions, comments, denunciations. Yeah.
Just wanted to comment on the coal mines.
Sure.
You showed the scene above ground.
Yes.
And it's interesting because I come from that part of the world. So the underground scenes that I've seen from Frank Leslie, you talk about how they have a narrative of expected narrative, and they're all sort of really antiseptic, sort of this brave person carrying another one out, like 260 people died. And part of the disconnect in that, I think, was that they didn't believe at that time, they didn't connect a coal mine disaster with problems in the mine brought around by the ownership. They called them acts of God. Mm-hmm. So hundreds and hundreds of people died, and it was just that's the way it was.
I think that's a great point. I think there are moments where they, and in fact, editorially, I know that in the case of Leslie, they indeed suggest, that they suggest editorially that we, the coal mine owners or the railroads have some responsibility, but they don't call for regulation or anything like that, and there's usually human error that's thrown in as part of it. Yes. So.
I'm really only familiar on a day-to-day basis with the major New York City newspapers in 1856 and 1857, but by that time, I mean, Leslie's is already in my opinion, in full bloom. And why is it that, at least on an occasional basis, the dailies like the Herald and the Sun and the Tribune did not utilize large-scale engravings?
No, it's a good question. Well, for a brief period of time, the Herald did do occasional cover wood engravings in the 1840s, actually. And then decided that, among other things, there's the problem of, as we discussed, the production process is so labor-intensive and takes so long that it's problematic in terms of a daily newspaper, and also because it used up valuable ad space. So there was a very, very clear-cut decision. Now, there were times, as you suggested, during the Civil War, daily newspapers had maps, for example. They didn't have portraits and so on, but they would have maps, many of which I think were actually prepared, basically worked on old engravings that they were able to work on, so maps of the battles. By the time daily newspapers start using illustrations, there's a different before the halftone and photographs. There's a brief period of time when they're doing, I think they're called process line engravings, and they are very, very, very cheap reproductions of very, very fine line work, so that you can't make a complicated image. You'll see in the daily newspapers in the 1890s, for example, very simple images that that are being printed that can be done very, very quickly. But you, for example, can't do anything complicated because it can't handle a lot of ink, but can be placed on a cylinder. But that's not until the 1890s. So there's,
Yeah, you make a good point about the ad revenue, because the broadsheets in mid-century are 4 pages or 8 pages, and that's it. And ads are not on the second page or the third page, but they're on the front page.
Right.
And then the last couple, 3 pages, so it's a very good...
So you don't want to use that. It's also, I think, an interesting question about what the public wants, because I firmly believe that it's the growing sectional crisis that more and more incites interest for pictorial images. There are numerous pictorial papers that rapidly rise and fall. P.T. Barnum has one for a year, for example, in the 1850s, which I think is called the New York, it's not the Illustrated, it's New York Illustrated something, I can't remember. But there are other ones. There's a Boston publication, Gleason's Pictorial, but Gleason's Pictorial tends to stay away from the news. There are occasional news images, but none of them are really, really successful. Partly because I think of this situation that people become more interested suddenly in seeing this late-breaking news, John Brown being a perfect example. It's one of the first big, Harper's Ferry, one of the first really big subjects in all of the papers. And at the same time, I think this production process, the creation of the composite block allows a much more rapid. I mean, the thing that for a long time confounded people looking at pictorial press is they're dated, much like a lot of magazines now, and it's actually the last day of the week of publication. People thought that they would be 2 weeks behind the events when they actually were more like a week behind the events. In some cases, less than a week behind the events.
Was it edition size or speed of publication or whatever that gave the nod to wood engraving over lithography, like Daumier in France and so on and so forth? I mean, you could make a drawing like that?
Sure. But lithography can't run with text, can't run with hot type, with print. So that was one problem. The wood engraving you could lay, with hot type.
Sure.
I think that's the main, the primary reason is that it to be sure, there was a lot of course, Currier and Ives make a living at it for quite some time, topical lithography that obviously was, telling a current event story, but it couldn't be mixed with type.
talking about, I enjoyed your talk. Thank you. That first image you showed of the sketch that the artist sent to be engraved, and it's very painter-like. You know, it's got like puffy white clouds, and it's got all these kind of highlights, and you don't really see that translate so well. And so I'm thinking this person is an academically trained artist who's looking at a lot of landscapes, and that made me think about the displacement that's happening because of photography, that a lot of people who were itinerant portrait painters or would, paint your house or your landscape and travel around, a lot of those people are setting up photography studios in the 1840s and 1850s, but also I imagine a lot of them are coming into this industry as well because there's less demand when people can get photographs. They're not buying paintings as much. And I'm wondering if you've encountered those kinds of intersections, and also, in terms of the work that's available for artists. And the second question I had is about the use of photographs, because I know in the Civil War, I've seen like the prisoner released from Andersonville, you can see the photograph and then the engraving. Like what's the ratio between the photographs being used for these and drawings?
Yeah, I mean, I inadvertently have sort of suggested that the twain never meet. And in fact, as you're saying, there's Matthew Brady, he probably stays afloat in part by selling a lot of photographs to Gardner does it too, but photographs to the illustrated press, particularly, by the way, portraits. If you're going to see a portrait, almost always the portrait is based on a photograph. And indeed, as I've raised, you'll see, for example, the famous images of the dead of Antietam and Gettysburg are reproduced as engravings. In some cases, they change. Things are further changed and so on. They're distinctly different. If you leave out the portraits, it's much more eyewitness. Now, having said that, one thing that I only came across in passing twice, quite frankly, reading like 50 years of Frank Lessing, was reference to photography wagons. One thing that Leslie admitted to, and I'm sure this is true of Harper's Weekly, particularly in New York City, was apparently itinerant photograph wagon. This sounds like Google, going around and photographing different scenes that then would be used as background reference. So an artist could say, okay, I'm doing the Lower East Side here, and this is the corner of so-and-so street. You can look at the reference. I mean, nobody says it outright, and we don't have any evidence. There are no collected papers of Frank Leslie's or anything like that. So photographic reference, I don't think there's any question, were used, and wherever possible. Now, having said that, and most of my work right now is now in the Civil War, what I've come to the realization in many cases is you don't, as far as we know, have photographs of a lot of the things that are then drawn by these artists. So, for example, the burning of the Provost Marshal's office on 3rd Avenue and I think it's 49th Street in Manhattan in 1863. Well, after fairly serious searching for photographs, saying it's got to have been based, I think that's a good example that people are getting images of places that never got photographed. That was the outskirts of New York City at that period of time. It was mainly vacant lots, with occasional, butcher shack and things like that. But that's an example of, yes, there's both a reliance on photography and at the same time there's clearly work being done that is, actually, that's the only evidence we have, take it or leave it, about what things look like in particular neighborhoods, particularly, by the way, working class neighborhoods. Now, your question in terms of artists is an interesting one. It's actually a very small group of artists. Now, certainly there were soldiers. After all, if you were professional military training, you learned to draw as one of the aspects of in West Point and so on. So there were a fair number of soldiers that would send in sketches, but they were not regular contributors. But when it comes down to it, is that not only did this coterie, I'd say altogether, maybe 30 people, for example, during the Civil War. There'll be certain, depending on the part of the country, sometimes, as a case of Pittsburgh, there's a guy named John Donahue who was a Pittsburgh artist who then sent it in, but he's like a stringer almost, so I think they had those. I think it was ways to make a living, even while you were doing painting and so on. Many of them, perhaps the majority, were immigrants. I've always been really, really struck how many of them are, and as you suggested, I think classically trained. They're all really young, obviously during the Civil War. I mean, nobody's older than their early 30s. And you'll see that, I mean, there'll be certain people you'll always see, they live their whole lives working for either Leslie's or Harper's Weekly. And you'll see their names repeated over and over again. But it's a surprisingly small, I mean, that's what I realized. The same thing like about cartoonists, by the way, in the period. There's a handful of them. They work, they leave one, Leslie paid terribly, or he didn't pay because he wanted to buy a boat, things like that. I mean, literally. So then they go over to Harper's, and then, they go back again, or they would work for another publication. But, and it doesn't seem like most of these, some of these artists had other lives. Matt Morgan, who actually had come from England, for example, he'd been a cartoonist in England and then was hired by Leslie, and then after a while he becomes a very famous scenic designer, for example. So there are additional careers.
Winslow Homer was one.
Yes. In fact, one of the Depression pictures showed of Chicago was Homer. I mean, he did most of his work, of course, during the Civil War and into the 1870s. But right, yes, exactly.
Was this kind of visual critical analysis part of the discussion at the time, or does this require that removed? Because it seems so clear as you're talking about it that why weren't they talking about it then?
What I've located, and maybe there are other people who have worked on this who have found similar or different things, was occasional. The most striking thing to me were the occasional times, since we don't have any paper collections and therefore don't have letters and so on, when on those few occasions when the publications published comments made by people. So, for example, I mentioned the one in Pittsburgh where particularly an editorial in the Pittsburgh Leader, which was a working class paper, wrote at great length about how important Leslie's coverage of particularly the scenes in Pittsburgh were in the accuracy and going to great detail. I've read other letters that they had published which were complaints saying, you drew, particularly by the way about miners, come to think of it, that during the whole, the long strike of the 1870s in the anthracite coal region, there was the complaints later that Leslie's published by a union leader saying, you've drawn us all like drunkards, and I'm really surprised about that because a lot of us read Frank, which is interesting in itself. A lot of us read Frank Leslie's here, and we expect this in Harper's Weekly. We didn't expect this from you. And then there are many anecdotes by artists. William Rogers, who was an artist for Harper's Weekly, in his memoirs wrote about, I went to this mine disaster, and I went to the local priest, and they said, I'm not talking to you. You work for Harper's Weekly. So, and I've seen that occasionally also in some African American response. But I must admit, maybe that's 10, in 50 years.
Do you suppose it was an editorial comment on the part of the artist to include black women and children in the mining disaster scene, or would they have been mixed in
No,
with the crowd?
I think that's a reportage. That's particularly, I think that was in Virginia, and there was actually there's active African American organizers in the miners' union at that period of time. But it's not commented on in the in the description.
After the engravings were published, what happened to what happened to their whereabouts, and if they're considered works of art now, or
Well, now, yeah, people would like to have them, but at the time, because it's much like lithographs as well, which is, you basically shaved it down because these would be fairly thick, and you could shave them down and use them at least over again for a period of time. So I think they're eminently disposable. That's why I was so surprised and excited to see these engravings in the National Museum of American History, because I'd never seen a collection like that. You do see occasional, if I remember correctly, there's Winslow Homer. They were smart enough to keep some engravings from Winslow Homer. Some of Thomas Nast's cartoons were kept, as the Library of Congress has some blocks, for example. But very, very little has remained. I mean, it's always striking to me how utterly disposable in all these publications, you know, the sort of lifeblood of the images work. The only reason we have sketches, the original sketches, and they're almost all from the Civil War, is because Leslie and Harper's, particularly Frank Leslie, they were the Metropolitan Fairs that the Sanitary Commission, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, had around the United States, but particularly in New York City. When the Metropolitan Fair was here, Leslie gave all these sketches to them to sell. And that's why they've ended up, I mean, the Library of Congress has some, the New York Historical Society has a bunch. You'll see them, Boston, I think Boston College has some now. The collection was just given to them. But the only reason they continued to, they were also eminently disposable. But the only reason they remained is because they were sold and people kept them as keepsakes. There are very few original sketches for anything after that.
From the selection that you showed, I was surprised. I really didn't see any influence of Daumier. And I'm just wondering, is that, you talked about cartoons, maybe that's just...
I didn't show cartoons.
No, but you talked about that that's sort of like a separate... But I'm just wondering, you know, were these sort of, in a way, like American painters that maybe didn't get to go to Europe, or were they afraid of ending up in jail? Or I mean, these to me, the faces seem sort of repetitive to a certain extent, not not like Daumier, who got really kind of commentary in there. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, there are a few individuals. I mean, when Nast starts working, he's an illustrator, for example, and then he becomes a cartoonist. I mean, he really goes into a different realm. But for the most part, most of the there's a distinction between the people doing cartooning and the people. Not to mention, although there are cartoons in, of course, Harper's Weekly and in Leslie's, there's a vast number of illustrated humor publications in the United States. During the Civil War, there are at least 7 of them in the North, and there are 2 in the South. Now, the ones in the South don't last very long, but my point here is there are a lot, and again, these same guys are working, and they're all guys. They're leaping from one publication to another, allowing themselves, in some cases, you look at Nast cartoons, illustrations of cartoons in Harper's Weekly during the Civil War, in Harper's Weekly, and then he also did it for, I think, a publication called Funny Fellow, where he went completely nuts compared to what he did in Harper's Weekly, not to mention racist and things that you never, or certainly the imagery was such. And if you look at the different publications, I must admit I've only begun to look at, it's quite striking the range. Speaking of, I don't think anybody's a Daumier here, and these guys were fast and loose, and even more importantly, with some exceptions, they did it for a buck. I mean, there's arguments made about, well, Nast had a belief. Certain other people had a belief. There were people like Frank Ballou who probably just did it because he made a lot of money, and so he just, you know, he would work for anybody. So it's an interesting question because of the issue of commercialization. Now, that's a whole different world than the lithography world, which in some cases, and in fact, the artists working on lithographic cartoons at that time, as well as lithography in general, are not the same artists who are working in the pictorial press. And in some of those cases, you have very clear-cut, and of course now I'm completely blanking on any of the names. As I said, none of them are quite like Daumier, but there's one particular artist whose name, I apologize, I can't remember, in Philadelphia, who's astounding. And you've probably seen some of his images. One of his famous ones is right after the Lincoln assassination, he has John Wilkes Booth in the forefront with the devil over Booth's shoulder. You know, very, very powerful images. And I would suspect in many of those cases when I've seen some of these people were trained in Europe, some of these people were trained by Europeans who came to the United States. Nast is a good example. He's trained by Theodor Kaufmann, who was an 1848er, radical, German radical, who does some of the important anti-slavery prints, but never works in the illustrated press. So I'm giving you not a full story, but it's a very distinctly different world than it is in Europe.
Because I've noticed after the war how many of the special artists during the war seem to come to some renown, and like the publications, even like illustrated histories, illustrated books after the war, right? Like kind of boast of that they have these artists
Yeah.
engraving and drawing and then engraving their books. I'm wondering like how wise the readers were to this process of the role of the artist, and how immediately artist sketches kind of gained agency in making memory of the Civil War in particular.
Well, they're actually pretty well known, because what Leslie's and Harper's do fairly early is realize that there's a market to get these guys famous, get known. And so they actually feature them. So let's say based on a sketch by Alfred Woe, or based on a sketch by Edwin Forbes, or so on. So that's one aspect. And by the way, it's also synonymous. It's happening at the same time in the daily press. That's where the byline is created in the American press. So they're the same sort of sort of merchandising of the previously anonymous people. Leslie for a while had stopped giving credit because of he was getting sued in some cases. There was a swill milk scandal very soon after Leslie's was created, and this is cows that were fed the garbage from breweries, and children were dying and getting sick and so on, and he got sued. So he stopped naming anybody, but then he started doing it again. Now, one of the things that happens is, in terms of memory, certainly all of the Leslie's and Harper's Weekly during the war and then after war have compendious volumes of reprints of their illustrations. But then there's also and Mark Noonan here may know this better than I do. For example, the Century magazine in I think it's the 1880s basically goes back to those artists and sort of says, all those sketches never got published. Well, we want you to go back now and re-sketch these images or so on. And it's very popular. It's published separately. It's also published within the Century magazine. And in fact, it's interesting because when you see, for example, in the Library of Congress, Edwin Forbes, who was a well-known Civil War a special artist, you'll see bits and pieces of these compositions he creates for the Century magazine in sketches that have nothing to do with one another, that he's now made a camp scene and things like that. But for a period of time, certain things get excised out. You don't see black soldiers in these recollections, for example, whereas they played a very featured role, during the Civil War. You do see, slaves who have fled, so-called contrabands, but again, they're presented as more picturesque. It's an interesting question: is how much does this, what influences this, this memory more? Is it photography, which of course is being reproduced and by the late certainly by the 80s and definitely by the 90s, publications will be printing them. I can't say for sure, and there's a sort of aesthetic aspect, of course, to the Century argument. This is now, these are our established, American artists who are doing it. I don't really believe there's been enough. There's been some work done on this, more about the lost cause and post-war painters and artists, but very, very little, I think, on this question. I think it's an interesting point.
I think we have to take one more
Sure.
question.
Quick.
No, in back, Mark,
Okay.
yes.
No, that's exactly right. That the Century did in the 1880s, the Civil War series, returned to the ideology of the Old South. And Century also, famously, even once two-tone, even once the technology changed, they insisted on sticking to the woodcut, woodblock engravings for all the reasons that you said. That they're interested in recovering, the Old South, this nostalgic look. They also, preferred to keep doing woodcuts, and which actually signaled their demise too when they were competing against the newer weeklies. So that's very interesting. And the other thing that you do a really wonderful job with, and the reason I love this period myself, is the dissonance, the disjuncture, and the evolution of history that's reflected. They do such a good job with, and the disjuncture between sometimes text and image. And when you describe the bread line, for example, I think it was the Harper's Weekly, and also the fact that Harper's Weekly was different than Frank Leslie's, I think it's a really important point that all the magazines were distinctive voices, and you do such a great job pointing that important fact out. But the distinction I was interested in, the breadline image, that the text actually speaks to these are people deserving their 1874 fate. But it does seem to me in that particular case, the artist has something else. It seems to me it
Could be.
seems to be sympathetic to, and that's actually another added excitement of looking at the text and the images, and because they don't correlate always,
Right.
and they kind of go off on their own, and there's just a lot going on.
Yeah, and we really, this is the maddening thing. Is we hear occasionally, mainly during the Civil War, somebody's, particularly Southerners, who occasionally Harper's Weekly or Frank Leslie makes it, into the South, and they'll write about saying how enraged they are by the presentation, but how very little, again, sort of discussing what Ed said before about reader response. This is, I have to admit, this is reading tea leaves.
Well, a very interesting reading of tea
Thank you.
leaves, and thank you very much.